Shenanigans.
All right, guys. So, Rob B., you found a horrific story about the remains of kids found at a school up in Canada. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so on May 28th, news agencies began reporting on the remains of 215 children, some as young as 3 years old, having been found buried on the site of what was Canada's largest Indigenous residential school, the Kamloops Residential School in BC, in British Columbia, which ran from 1893 to 1978. Um, this is, and residential schools it was a horrible situation. They suspect that more bodies may be found because there are some areas that still remain to be searched, and they are using ground penetrating radar to assist the search. So, for those of you who don't know, residential schools were government sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro Canadian culture.
Mm.
So, residential schools were created by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to assimilate them into Canadian society.
So, they were trying to convert natives to Canadians or English.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. However, the schools really ended up disrupting the lives and communities, causing long-term problems among Indigenous peoples. The schools ran from circa 1833 to 1997. The last one closed in 97. Um, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement has recognized that 139 of these residential schools existed across Canada. At its peak in 1931, there were about 80 schools operating in the country. So the announcement has understandably sparked outrage across our nation. Flags have been flying at half mast. People have been laying hundreds of tiny shoes and toys in public squares, places of government, on the steps of churches to reference the role that Christian churches played in this extermination, this horrible, despicable act. Um, During an interview with Global News, Shirley Williams, a survivor, said she was quoted as saying, "They hid the bodies. Even though they were nuns and priests and things like that, they did things that were not proper." And there are hundreds of accounts of survivors from these residential schools. Torture, cruelty, severe and unusual punishment, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, murder. And a lot of the times when these things were reported, law agencies became complicit with the reports. There was nothing to report. Okay, it was just another missing kid. No charges are going to be pressed. So now there's a small coalition of more than a dozen lawyers across Canada that have formally requested that the International Criminal Court investigate the Canadian government and the Vatican for crimes against humanity following preliminary reports about the remains of the children. Um, and if this happens, the investigation could lead to the prosecution of employees, agents, and actors of the Catholic Church, the Government of Canada, who were either involved in the creation and cover up of the burial grounds. And that's it. Like, the survivors are coming forward. The Vancouver Archbishop issued a formal apology to the First Nations people after the preliminary findings after the bodies were initially found.
Mhm.
Pope Francis has met with both Vatican-based Canadian cardinals on Saturday to discuss this, but we really haven't heard from the Pope on it. Many Canadians have called on the Pope for a formal apology for the Catholic Church's role in the residential schools. And yeah, I guess Pope Francis was elected in 2013. He's already apologized for the church's role in colonialism in the Americas, but he hasn't addressed the residential schools, and he usually does these apologies during papal visits, and no papal visits are on the calendar as it stands in Canada at this time. Um, so June is Pride Month, but it also in Canada, the month of June is National Indigenous History Month. So it's important to be discussing this also today. So I want your reactions, your opinions, recommendations for the federal government, religious leaders on reparations, because this story made me feel gross as a Canadian. Typically, I say I'm Canadian, and there's a good feeling with that because we've had a relatively good reputation internationally, and this is a huge blemish. It's heinous. It's reprehensible. It's completely ethically bankrupt. So I'm just I'm personally at a loss and just dealing with this. So I'm looking to you for your reactions, your opinions, and recommendations you would have for people that are dealing with it, or for the governments and the church.
Let's start with Liz.
I think this is a perfect example of, again, why I don't really um, care about apologies too much. I think as it relates to evil acts, criminal acts in our society, the justice system, governments, they think that, okay, if I offer an apology, if I give out thoughts and prayers, that'll make everything okay without changing policies, without being more strict when it comes to punishment and holding people accountable for these things. I mean, again, we're talking about, Catholic Church, we're talking about religion, we're talking about, a group of people that in this particular case, not only because I'm sure that there not only was the murder of these children involved, but also some type of sexual abuse, and
Mhm.
no one being held accountable for that. Like, if this were my child, or if I'm that child who is in that, situation, what the fuck is an apology going to do for me? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so this is why I think, we need to start holding not just the accusers, the suspects, the criminals accountable, but we also need to start holding law enforcement and governments accountable to get them to see that these acts are serious and there needs to be serious consequences, especially for, vile and violent acts that are perpetrated against children across the board, whether it's in the United States or Canada, throughout the world. Children have no rights. They have no rights whatsoever. And so in situations like this, it's just like, okay, we're sorry. We found 200 and X number of bodies. Let's just sweep it under the rug. That was awful. All right, let's move on. And I agree with Rod. There needs to be, accountability. There needs to be, more laws and punishment enacted, but there also needs to be some type of compensation, because in this day and age, the only way to get people to pay attention is you either put them in jail or you get them in their pockets. So now it's time we need to start going into people's pockets,
So you're talking
making folks
reparations.
pay. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Mayor Patrick.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I agree with Lizzie on this one. The what struck me about reading this article is that the parallels between what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, the whole situation with the history of race relations in the United States, and really just the seeming inability or unwillingness to reckon with the past in a way that acknowledges the horrible things that have been done to certain groups of people, and to come to a way to deal with that acknowledges that not just acknowledges it, but goes beyond it, and redresses it, and comes up with a way to resolve it, and to pursue restorative justice, and pursue remedies that can make right what happened in the future to the greatest extent, or in the past, to the greatest extent possible. And it may there are some things that are so horrible that you can never fully redress, but something needs to be done to look at these families, these people who lost their children, and whose children are never coming home again. Where are these families now? There are probably still people dealing with this loss that has been unacknowledged and uh, unaddressed by the Canadian government, just like in the United States with what's happened in our history to native to indigenous peoples, to the African American community, to racial minorities throughout our history, that we just haven't been able to come to terms with in any sort of appropriate way or adequate way.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know how I feel about kids. So when I saw the story, it definitely saddened me. I mean, 215 bodies of children.
And they
And
anticipate finding more, and this is at just one site. They are going to be At this point, they're going to be revisiting all of the residential school sites to see if they have similar findings, because there are numerous accounts of. One of the more heartbreaking stories I read was from a man who's now in his 70s, recounting when he was a child, going out with a friend and from the school and a nun down to the hillside to dig holes to bury two of their classmates. No ceremony. There was nobody crying. There was nobody speaking. And they just dug these graves, buried the bodies, and went back to the school. And he wishes that he remembers where these bodies were. But this is the 215 is, that's just the first number.
No,
I mean,
I agree with
when
you. I think that, yeah, that's just a small number. That doesn't even, begin to open up all of the atrocities that were done here.
when I hear stories like that, and I put myself in those situations, and I can imagine just like what that must have been like. And it just seems so horrible to be a child caught up in that situation, to even see those atrocities, to see things like that happening. And I mean,
After having been removed from your home so that you could be taught how to behave in society.
Yeah,
The most vulnerable. The most vulnerable.
People who can't speak for themselves, can't do anything about it. And that's the reason. That's the reason it bothers me with kids, because it's like you can't do anything. I remember when I was a child going through tough situations, I felt powerless. I was like, I can't fix this. I can't, and even today I try to be a fixer. I try to problem solve and fix things. And back then I know I was similar, and there was nothing I could do. I couldn't get out of the situation. I couldn't remove myself from the situation. I couldn't remove my brother and sister from the situation. I couldn't do anything. And I can't imagine with these particular kids, because I've always felt that even though my situation was tough, there's people in worse situations than I went through, and have dealt with way worse than I have. And I can't even imagine what that's like. And I mean,
But you know what else is also a part of this panel is that Hollywood has made a lot of money off of stories like this, because like Rob said, this isn't the first story, won't be the last. It's not just happening in Canada. It's definitely happened, 1,000 times over in the United States. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Sleepers from the late 90s, early 2000s.
I know it, but I haven't seen it.
But it was about this particular topic. Brad Pitt was in it. I can't remember.
Oh no, I did watch it. I know what you're talking about. I think De Niro was in it.
Yeah.
Yep,
So it was
I did
about
watch it.
young boys being abused
In the Catholic Church.
In the Catholic Church, when they were, sent to their priests for direction, for instruction, for mentorship. And so Hollywood has also made a lot of money off of stories like this. We know it's happening, but no one's doing anything
about it. All right, we're running out of time, so let's get to the comments real quick. So Jose says, absolutely shameful. Notice these atrocities, this is Jacqueline Robinson, notice these atrocities typically happen to populations that aren't in a position to advocate for themselves and are powerless. Let's see, what is it? Olivia says, what atonement, but that's what atonement is, acknowledging and changing. Let's see, Olivia said, we love you, Neo, P.S. your brother and sister. Sleepers, incredible movie, says Jose. This may be an unpopular, because this is Olivia, may be an unpopular comment, makes me think about all those aborted babies that have no rights either to protect children. So, all right, we're going to, unfortunately not, does anybody want to comment on anything, any of those comments?
I just want to make one last comment. I really appreciated everything that you had to share, and to segue into Patrick's segment, I really wish that residential schools had been a part of my curriculum, because this is something we've only been talking about as a nation for the last decade or so. And if I would have known about the struggles of Indigenous people in my youth as part of my formal education, it would have changed me as a person early in life. I would not have bought into what I was hearing from society, from my peers. I would have actually connected with the culture, because all I was taught about indigenous peoples was that the Europeans came and they were savages that they traded fur and foods with, and that they taught us how to survive off the land. And that was pretty much the extent of what we learned about the indigenous tribes that were here prior to European settlement. Shameful. We need to hear what actually happened. Real history makes you squeamish because real history is ugly because humans can be really ugly.
Well, Rob, it's similar here. I mean, if you look at, former Senator Rick Santorum and why he was fired let go from CNN, it was because of his comments that he made about Native American people and how they had not contributed to, American society, to the United States of America, and how Europeans came here and that the country was a blank slate, and the Europeans were responsible for current day America. I mean, that's kind of what we're taught here. There's no, or like you said, segueing into both Neo and Patrick's topics about how our true history is not really being taught. And so then because of that, you have people who are looked down on and who are vulnerable and who are not seen as actual humans.
Yep. Time's really tight. We got to move on, guys. Got to move on. Sorry about that. All right.
Truth, lies, shenanigans.
All right, Mayor Patrick, you're up. Repubs are moving forward with banning race theory in schools. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that's happening not just in Oklahoma, but in different states around the country. But Oklahoma is the latest one to make news. Is that states are Board of Education and state legislators are banning the teaching of quote unquote critical race theory in schools, and a lot of people, since a lot of people don't know what exactly critical race theory means, they have to put it out there in a way that schools can interpret. And the language in Oklahoma, and I'm looking at this in the article because I want to make sure I get it right. It says they're banning lessons that include the concept that, quote, one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, that a person's, quote, moral character is inherently determined by his or her race or sex, or that someone should feel discomfort, guilt, or distress on account of their race or sex.